Frank, you're a pulmonologist. I gotta know, is vaping better for you than cigarettes?
Doug, you just put your finger on a $64,000 question. Vaping, since the inception of vaping 15 or 18 years ago, it's been presented to the public as a safer alternative to cigarette smoking. And naturally, everybody's looking for a safer cigarette, right? Everybody knows smoking cigarettes are no good for you in the long run. And so finding a safer cigarette is a nice compromise position. In fact, I would say that there's even elements of the federal government that have adopted the position that vaping is a safer alternative to combustible cigarettes. And they're trying to sort of promote movement from cigarette use over to vaping. There's a couple of things to keep in mind when you're thinking about the relative safety versus toxicity of vaping products. The first is really what are the constituents of the products? Not all products are the same. The device itself has to generate an aerosol, and that aerosol has physical and chemical characteristics that get delivered to the lung. So it's not just what chemicals are in the vape aerosol. It's really about the size of the particles, the temperature of the aerosol, all those things will influence the relative toxicity of the aerosol in the lung and in the tiny little blood vessels that feed the lung from the heart. The second thing to keep in mind is it has everything to do with user characteristics. So you can imagine that if you're using regular cigarettes and you're a pack-a-day smoker, there's sort of a unit bias. In other words, you light a cigarette, you finish the cigarette, you put it out, you go some period of time before you light up the next one. But with vaping, there is no unit bias. There's a lot of unconscious, or I should say maybe subconscious use of vape aerosol. There's a sort of constant stream, constant delivery of aerosol to the lung, which the frequency of which has a big influence on the relative toxicity, regardless of what the components of the aerosol are. And the third thing to keep in mind is that we have always assumed that if a person is moving from cigarette use to vaping use, that if the vape device substitutes for one cigarette over the course of the day, that's one cigarette less that that person is consuming. But it turns out that toxicity doesn't really work that way, that people who are in transition, who use both devices based on context or circumstances, are actually at higher risk for lung damage and cardiovascular damage than if they just used either device alone.
So vaping is harmful for the lungs because that was like the big thing that people were saying is that like at least the vape stuff doesn't have carcinogens and stuff that
Yeah.
cigarettes does. And so therefore it's way safer for your health long term. Like talk in depth about what it does to the lungs, like vaping and the difference between vaping and cigarettes and the impact on the lungs.
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. Recognize that the concept of fewer carcinogens is I don't want to call it a false flag, but it's really sort of a straw man argument when it comes to safety concerns over this aerosol. It's great that there are fewer carcinogens. That's awesome. And it probably means that there is some modification in cancer risk, at least as far as the lung is concerned, over time. And that's a good thing. That's awesome. But cancer of the lung isn't the only risk we got to worry about, right? So there's lots of other competing potential harms. So point one is that the inflammatory elements, the inflammatory characteristics of the aerosol contribute to cancer risk, regardless of whether there are carcinogens in the aerosol or not. That's number one. Number two, suppose just as an example, suppose uh, aerosol X reduces cancer risk, lung cancer risk to zero, but elevates heart disease risk 2-3-fold. Can we actually say that product X is actually less harmful? And so with specifics, to answer your question specifically, the research suggests that even in naive or first-time users, temporary intermittent exposure to e-cigarette aerosol under controlled conditions results in measurable changes in heart work, cardiac output, exercise capacity, blood vessel diameter, resistance, and pressure characteristics of peripheral flow, which would be a good marker for what's going on to flow in the heart itself. And so we know that the aerosol, regardless of whether it comes from a cigarette or from a vape device, causes a lot of what's referred to as oxidative stress in the body. And so it's really the downstream effects of that oxidative stress that we're going to have to worry about that have nothing to do with risk of lung cancer. So even if lung cancer risk goes to zero, theoretically, we still have harms we got to deal with before we anoint any particular product as safer than cigarettes.
Wasn't there something about popcorn lung and vaping? What is there validity to that, and what does that actually mean?
Sure. So popcorn lung itself is a form of lung scarring that pulmonologists decades ago identified. So when you go to the movie theater and you order a large popcorn with extra butter, they're not actually using butter. What they're using is a vegetable oil mixture that contains a chemical called diacetyl, and diacetyl is the component that gives it that buttery sense. We feel that as butter. And it was workers in in a factory that used diacetyl for industrial product production that were developing this very specific form of lung scarring. And in the earlier forms of vape devices, like in first and second generation of vape devices, there were significantly measurable concentrations of diacetyl in the aerosol. And so the potential for developing popcorn lung was front and center in every pulmonologist's mind. I think as we moved into the fourth generation, the sort of dual class vape devices, the more current disposable devices, diacetyl is a little less of a concern. It's more about the sort of overall inflammatory effect of the aerosol and how that's going to turn into lung scarring in the future.
What do you think's the biggest myth you're seeing online right now, or just from people that you talk to regarding vaping and its safety?
Right. So it's funny, but even the word vaping is really misinformation, right? The whole notion that this is water vapor was a marketing tool that was used in the early years of introduction of these devices to the United States market. There is nothing water vapor about this. If you can see it, it's not a vapor, it's an aerosol. And so the way the aerosol is produced is the solution, the juice, the vape juice has to be drawn across a heating element within the device. That heat causes a bit of a chemical reaction where the juice reacts with water vapor in the air to form the aerosol droplets that we see. But whatever we see is no longer vapor, right? You can't see vapor. So that I would say that is an important implicit message that young initial users are getting that suggests to them that this is, it's what is it? It's a cloud. It's a vape cloud. It's water vapor, that kind of stuff. Puts them in the wrong frame of mind. The second misconception, bit of uh, misinformation is actually related to that. So if you think about it, when you watch another person draw off their vape device, breathe in deep, kind of pause for half a beat, and then exhale, whatever you see coming out is really only a portion of the total aerosol that that person was exposed to. The way the lungs work, when you deliver an aerosol to the lungs, the particle size of the little droplets that make up that aerosol is extremely important in determining whether stuff is going to get deposited in the lungs or whether it's going to come back out. And it's only the portion of the aerosol that is, quote, respirable that actually makes it all the way down into the lungs and gets deposited there. The rest is non-respirable and comes back out. So, when you see young folks with their large tank systems and the big batteries and you cranked up all the watts to create heat at that heating element, so that they create these large vape clouds and do all these really incredibly interesting tricks. What they're breathing out is half, maybe two-thirds of what they breathed in the first place. And I think that that's actually a big part of the issue.
So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what vaping can do to like breathing patterns. Like you think of somebody that just vapes all day, they're definitely changing the way they breathe, maybe their mouth shape, their lung capacity and stuff. Like how does
Right.
vaping impact people from a respiratory function?
Yeah. So what we know so far is even in early users, people have been using their vape devices for just a couple of years. They tend to develop chronic bronchitis. So there's this background cough that they'll experience. Sometimes it's productive of a little bit of mucus, sometimes it's not. They're at higher risk of developing pulmonary infections, either from some flu-like virus in the air or even, in worst case scenarios, um, uh, some bacterial infection causing a pneumonia or something. So the lungs' defensive mechanisms are compromised to some degree after exposure to vape aerosol. And finally, we know that the sort of EVALI or the e-cigarette induced vaping lung injury, um, we don't think too much about that. It's not in the news anymore, but that is an occasional effect of this overwhelming inflammatory response to the aerosol's presence in the lungs. So the lungs react badly. That reaction goes off the rails, the brakes are off, and the next thing you know, the lungs are like totally inflamed and non-functional, at least temporarily. In the long run, we worry that exposure to vape aerosol is likely to cause uh, basically the same kinds of respiratory pattern issues as cigarette smoking does. If you just think about it just for a second, just a hypothetical, if we were in the same place 120 years ago where cigarettes were just becoming available and people were transitioning from alternate forms of tobacco use to cigarette use because it's more refined, it smells less, it's cheaper, it's more available and easier to use. We would have no idea that cigarettes were so harmful to people at a similar point in social uptake. And so I would suggest to you that in the long run, the respiratory issues that are most likely to occur are probably going to mirror the respiratory pattern issues, even if they're not necessarily the same cancer risk issues. There are those other problems we have to be concerned about as well. And I'll just say one last thing on that topic. I mentioned the inflammatory effects of vape aerosol earlier. Um, so the scientists can actually sort of discern different types or flavors of inflammation within the lungs. And it turns out that the type of inflammation that is most likely to happen as a result of vape aerosol exposure is closer to the kind of inflammation that happens with interstitial lung disease, the lung scarring syndromes, like occupational health hazards and that sort of thing, than cigarette smoking is. And so, uh, what worries me at night is while vaping may help some people transition away from cigarettes and then eventually stop smoking, every population is made up of a wide variety of different effects. And on balance, I worry that that while those people may be helped, there's likely to be a substantial subset of people who are going to suffer illness that they don't expect.
You brought up a really good point. If you think about it, most people, not all, but a lot of people that are trying to quit something like cigarettes, they're quitting it for a number of reasons. And one of the main ones is that they're addicted to it. They've developed these unhealthy habits and
Right.
behaviors around that substance. And so then you transition them to something like vaping, and
Right.
they're just going and picking up another addictive habit. And I feel like vaping has been this thing that people have just let go and say, it's okay. They're not smoking cigarettes. They're not putting a needle in their arm. They're not snorting cocaine. They're not smoking crack. They're
Yeah.
not doing all these other quote unquote more harsh things. So we'll just let this go. Is this a big warning to people to take this more seriously so that they're not going to pay for it in years' time?
Yeah. Wow. What a great question. And I want to answer your question by first framing the current conceptualization of addiction from within the field. Okay. So when you and I are just sort of talking over a beer and we use the word addiction, what comes to mind is the larger sort of social syndrome that we think of as addiction. People using hard drugs, people getting high, people trying not to withdraw, people doing illegal or unfortunate things in order to maintain this behavior pattern, et cetera. And that's really the image that comes to mind. But in order to understand addiction more fully, what I want you to think about is what happens if we strip away all of the sort of social context of the addiction syndrome? What is the most fundamental, most atomic level behavioral characteristics that define all addictions, whether it be to food, to gambling, to alcohol, to heroin, or to nicotine? And addiction in that from that point of view is really not about getting high or about avoiding withdrawal. Addiction then becomes about whether or not a substance is capable of compelling a behavior that the person displaying that behavior would rather not do. So if I have a gambling problem, you might say I'm addicted to the idea of gambling, and I recognize that I'm spending my money and I'm losing my job and my family is dissolving and all the rest of that stuff, but I remain compelled to go to the roulette table. So with tobacco or with nicotine, nicotine is the perfect distillation of that idea. It has no significant euphoric effects, and people are not getting high. They're not losing their jobs. Their family's not dissolving. They're not really driven to avoid some horrible, dramatic withdrawal syndrome. People do withdraw a little bit, but you know what? They get a little headache or they feel a little grumpy. What's the big deal? And so you say to yourself, well, why do people keep doing it even after they want to stop? When that's because nicotine as a drug is what's really good at creating that compulsion to continue delivering nicotine to the brain. There is a instinctive drive that simply says, screw it, get me some. No matter how much you want to stop, how much it's costing you, how much you're worried about your lungs, that drive says, I'll feel safe, I'll feel secure, I'll feel complete after you vape. Now, given that, the vape devices that are on the market now, particularly the new disposable devices, are really high-tech nicotine delivery devices. They're using synthetic forms of nicotine that have been moderated or adjusted in order to maximize their addictive potential. And so even casual experimentation with these devices, if you are at a vulnerable period in life, a teenager or young adult or something like that, creates that compulsion to continue using despite a desire to not use. How does that affect us? If you take every single effect from here down off the table, don't let's just say there's a magic device, doesn't cause lung disease, heart disease, diabetes, that none of it. What's happening upstairs is exposure to nicotine puts you at risk for being depressed,
Mm.
it puts you at risk for developing an anxiety disorder, it puts you at risk for having difficulty concentrating, paying attention. It puts you at risk. You ready for this, Doug? It puts you at risk for being more prone to the addictive potential of other drugs, cocaine, opioids, alcohol. There is a reason why people in opioid recovery smoke at very high rates. There is a reason why people who engage or who enter into opioid recovery are most afraid of having to change their cigarette use, the tobacco use behaviors at the same time. There's overlap between the effects of these chemicals and their sort of subtle behavioral uh, uh, effects that don't get measured easily in epidemiologic studies about heart disease, lung disease, cancer. That was the longest answer to the shortest question you've had to deal with.
Well, I guess the nuts and bolts of it is that vaping should be taken just as seriously
Oh yeah.
as any other drug that you mentioned there towards the end.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
and then it shouldn't just be this thing where it's like, "It's okay, like, at least my child isn't doing X," or, "It's okay, at least I'm not doing this." Because I know in the recovery community, there's this idea that if you're somebody who is smoking cigarettes, vaping, snorting cocaine, putting a needle in your arm,
Yeah.
all the things, that you should start with what's destroying your life in the near term first and then work
Yeah.
from there. And I think the problem is so many people stop there. They stop at the
Right.
heroin or cocaine or whatever, and then they develop a nicotine addiction.
Right.
And I think that when you take an addict and you tell them that they can still do another addictive substance, the addict's going to go, okay, well, that's great. And
Yeah.
then it just ends up playing out negatively in that person's life. And I just think it's a really important conversation to have because there's a lot of people that will say, you don't have compassion for me. You don't have this, you don't have that. It's like, I think people have compassion for people in that
Yeah.
position for sure. It's more like, do you want to hear like the actual truth of where this leads? Or do you want, somebody to kind of sugarcoat it for you? And I'm guessing that at the beginning of someone's journey, it's got to be somewhere in between so that they feel motivated enough to change when
Yeah.
they're in that low state. But eventually the goal should be to quit nicotine as well.
Yeah. I mean, you're bringing up a ton of really great points. If I'm a parent of a adolescent who is starting to play around with, strawberry banana flavored disposable vapes, it's not harmless. My eyeballs would not be focused on the long-term implications on heart, lung, or cancer. My eyeballs would be focused on the development of depression in the child. Suicidal risk, suicidality goes up about 2 to 3 fold among adolescents who are vaping.
Wow.
Their ability to concentrate in school and get good grades goes down if they're vaping. Their susceptibility to becoming addicted to marijuana and alcohol after the sort of casual junior year or Friday night party after the football game goes up. All those are the things that I would really be worried about. In a similar way, when I think about the recovery community, and we actually do some work within the recovery community to try and help them understand that middle ground that you're talking about. Clearly, absolutely, everyone's first order of business has to be about the issues, the behaviors that are destroying that person's life, putting them at risk for accidental overdose. There is no dispute that that is the number one priority. However, having said that, in order to mitigate that risk, in order to be as effective as we can be providing service to that person, we have to understand the totality of the picture and how nicotine exposure continues to affect that. So it's, should I do opioids or should I do nicotine? Or as long as I'm doing nicotine, I'm not doing opioids. That's not really the right picture. Did you know that if you are an opioid addicted person, that your risk of I should say your ability to maintain long-term sobriety goes up about relative 50% if you've also stopped using nicotine over the long term. If you're an alcohol addicted person, your ability to maintain long term, we're talking 9 years, 10 years sobriety, about doubles if you work on changing the nicotine exposure at the same time. The question should never be either or. It's not about which substance you're using. It's about how substances are affecting pathways in the brain and how those pathways affect my ability to reach my the behavioral goals that I have.
I've talked to several people that have quit vaping, and I've heard that the withdrawal can be brutal. Is that because of the vaping itself, or is that because of the amount that they were doing?
It's probably both, right? So the device is delivering a more high tech form of nicotine. Just to give you a sense, uh, there are some vape devices out there that are currently capable of delivering about 70% of the nicotine in the freebase form. You've heard of freebasing cocaine. Well, nicotine can be freebased too.
I've heard
Cigarettes.
of it. I used to do it.
So you get the idea, right? So if you take nicotine and turn it into the free base form, you turn it into a gas, and that gas can be delivered to the lungs. And that where absorption is very rapid and delivery to the brain is very impactful. Um, so cigarettes, to give you a sense, cigarettes deliver about 30 to 35% of their nicotine in the free base form. The newer vape devices can deliver 70% or so in the free base form. So there's a lot of available nicotine being delivered very quickly to the brain. And the second part of that is also it's just so much easier to just vape without really thinking about it. There was a study that was published earlier this year that was done in high school seniors and young adults where they were asked to continue their vape behaviors, but use an electronic counting device so that it would count how many hits they took. And at the end of each day, they were asked to record the approximate number of hits that they remembered taking. And the difference was they took 9 times more hits than they recalled
Mm.
taking, than they estimated taking. So there's a lot of automatic behaviors that are driven by the vape device that are operating just below the level of awareness that put people at risk for having this major withdrawal effect when they finally decide not to do the behavior anymore. Boom, they put it down. The body, and most specifically the brain, is really not prepared for that absence. It's a bad breakup.
And what have you found to be effective in helping people like quit vaping for good?
So look, you're a trainer. You know that if you and I engage in a program where you're going to try and help me achieve my wellness goals, you're going to think through not just what I need to do behaviorally, but also what kinds of tools I might require in order to be able to achieve those goals most effectively and most safely. Right. And so I would say that there's a lot of behavioral advice that people can be getting about how to deal with stress, for example, in more productive ways, about just even understanding what the connection is between nicotine delivery and how it makes you feel after a stressful event in your life. Just understanding that process can help put you in control. So there are behavioral strategies that a good coach can talk with the vape user to be helpful. But there's also tools, and those tools in my world are the cessation assist devices, the medications, either the pills, the patches, the gum, the lozenges, those sorts of things. The mistake that people make when they think about those tools is they imagine that if they, say, for example, slap a patch on, that the vaping or the cigarette smoking will disappear. That's a little like assuming that if I put a good pair of running shoes on, that I ought to be able to simply run a marathon, just because I'm wearing a good pair of shoes. So what we tell people is consider those things not as substitute nicotine delivery devices, but as really as tools that help put you in a position to be able to do the behavioral work to eventually work yourself toward a goal where you're getting through a day without obsessing about your vape device, without feeling that compulsion to get a hit, screw it, just get me some, without feeling the negative emotional responses of abstinence and denial and that kind of stuff. You need to feel good about the skills that you're developing, and it's very much a a training kind of experience. It's sort of long. It's not long term, but there is a. It's not like tomorrow you're going to be able to make my muscles bigger and me healthier. We have to work towards that goal. It's the same thing with trying to put the nicotine delivery devices down.
And do you think that community plays a big role in helping people quit long term?
I do. I think the community plays a big role in both directions. So I've been studying this problem deeply for 30 years, and frequently a person comes to me, we sit for an hour, we talk through the nature of their problem, we kind of assess what their goals are. We develop a joint sort of strategy for achieving those goals. I feel really good about the direction that the visit went in. We have a plan. We're going to move forward. They go home, and one of two things happens. Their best buddy or close family member says, "What did you guys talk about?" "Oh, that's great. Let's do that. That sounds like a good idea." Or their best buddy or close family member goes, "Nah, that's ridiculous. The way I did it was I just put them down one day." And so, in social connections, the network that people have a very large influence on their ability to achieve behavior change in both directions. I think if I'm speaking now to members of that network for another person, let's say a parent for a teenage vapor or a spouse of a cigarette smoker, I would say the best thing you could do is ask questions about your loved one's experience. What is it that they derive from it? What do they experience? What's the nature of that drive that puts them in a position to continue wanting to use it? What are their goals? What knowledge gaps are there? Are there bits of information that could be helpful that we don't have access to? And then you ask those questions and give fewer answers. Just allow the questions to be there and be supportive in finding answers to those questions that make sense to the person that you love.
So if you had a son and he was like, "Dad, um, I'm gonna quit smoking. I want to try vaping." Would you
Mhm.
be like, "Absolutely not. We're gonna do it this way." Like you are so convinced based on your work and your research that there is no reason for a parent to allow their kid to vape instead of smoke.
Well, I think every parent in the audience recognizes that there are limits to sort of what we kind of can allow, right? Because the kids, as they get older, they're doing a bunch of stuff on their own. They're making their own decisions. So the way I would approach it is, if they're already if the premise is that the young person is already smoking cigarettes and it wants to use vaping as a means of transitioning away from cigarettes, I would actually start by engaging the kid in conversation about, what are your goals and what makes the idea of the vape an attractive tool for achieving that goal. How do you plan to use the vape most productively so that you will be able to achieve your goal? How will you know if the vape isn't working to help you achieve that goal? if it turns out that the only thing that young person is willing to consider is the vape, I wouldn't stop them from using it. In the short term, it's not a big deal, but I would try and partner with that, with that, with my son, in order to sort of make sure that it's helping him accomplish what he set out to accomplish. I would also make sure he understood that there are risks and benefits, right? And that there are other mechanisms that are also available, that in the right hands can be safe, definitely proven safe, can be comfortable, can be more effective at helping them achieve the non-smoking goal than the vape is. And so we would talk about the relative balance of pros and cons of the decision to use the vape. Um, and then I would express my disappointment. No, no, I'm only kidding.
So what is the benefit to vaping? I mean, you said you don't get this euphoric rush. You know, back in the day, like smoking cigarettes was like cool. You saw people in the movies do it, people in like music, you know, that was like it was a thing that people like thought that was the quote unquote cool thing to do. And when you took your first hit off a cigarette, you got this pretty euphoric like buzz, I guess, at the beginning, but then it just tails off. Is the is the benefits for people, is it the same as cigarettes? Are they doing it for the same reasons, or is it completely different?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same reasons. The social context within which they're doing it is different now than it was, in the 1950s and 60s in the heyday of James Dean smoking on the movie screen and stuff like that. But still, it's basically the same physiology. The place in the brain where nicotine works is the place in the brain where our survival system sense safety and security, right? Correctness. And so if your survival instincts send you an impulse to run away from, the grizzly bear, and you successfully run away from the grizzly bear, the survival systems reinforce themselves by sending out a safety signal saying, "Hey, that was a good thing to do, Doug. You're safe, you're secure, you don't have to worry anymore." There's a sense of release and a sense of relief of having escaped this survival threat, right? That sense of relief and release is the function of chemical signaling and chemical communication within the brain. And nicotine acts as an imposter safety signal in those very systems. And so we don't need the grizzly bear anymore. What we need is, the bell rings at the end of third period and I'm supposed to vape. And if my brain, the instinctive part of my brain sends the signal, get me some, and I don't do it, I don't have that resolved survival impulse. I feel anxious. I feel nervous. The invasive thoughts start. I can't think about anything else until I finally just, say to myself, screw it. Just take a couple of hits and move on. And that it's a feedback loop that must be gratified. And until it's gratified, the brain won't let you do anything else until the feedback loop has been completed. That's really where the benefit of vaping lies.
So it just seems like it's just like an addiction. It's like compulsive behaviors, and
That's
then
that.
that can trigger and lead to other compulsive behaviors based on what you're saying. So how can we do better as a society at looking at this? Because like I've said a couple times, you've mentioned it, it kind of falls
Yeah.
by the wayside. Do you think there needs to be more um, like conversations like this? Do you think there needs to be like risks? Like I know like what tried to help, I think with tobacco was that there was blatant like risks listed
Yeah.
on cigarette products. Like, do you think the same needs to be done for vaping?
Yes, I do. So I actually think that as a society, we have focused on the long term health effects of tobacco product exposure. But I don't think that's where the money is, particularly if we're trying to have conversations with young people. Um, if I were 18 years old and you were telling me that I'm at risk for developing lung cancer when I'm 70, the tendency is to discount that risk in favor of what I'm derived the social benefits of of vaping that I'm deriving currently. And that's natural. So I think what we really ought to do, believe it or not, is stop talking about the risks. Like if I'm going to have a conversation with a young person in particular, the conversation, I can acknowledge the risks. I can say, this is what I'm concerned about, but the risks are not the immediate reason to change behavior. And so now what I'm doing, I'm shifting the conversation away from, Doug, don't you know that smoking is bad for you? And I'm shifting it away from that to, Doug, I'm worried about you because smoking is bad for you. But I don't understand why you smoke as well as I could. Could we talk about what your experience is, what it does for you, what you think about? Basically, what I'm saying, Doug, is I want the conversation to move towards understanding the dependence phenomenon around nicotine products and away from just this ongoing, constant, you know, threatening people with, you're going to die if you don't stop, or you're an idiot if you don't stop, or I can't, like the conversation's all around character flaw. Where really, what it really needs to be around, Doug, I know you're a good guy. I know that this is not lining up with who you are. Let's talk about how brain change has affected your ability to control some of these behaviors. Like what's going on the inside is a much more fruitful conversation for us to be having as a community.
I agree. The scare tactics just haven't worked, right?
Right.
I mean, people go to prison for life for murder and they still murder people, right? Like people know the risks for, um, and by the way, I'm not opposed to people going to jail. Obviously, I'm just making a point. But the idea that you can just scare somebody into not doing a behavior, I just think is not as effective as you would think. I think it's effective. I think they're like when I was on probation, I was mortified of going back to jail, and
Yeah.
that was a big reason why I didn't do anything, and I
Yeah.
think that's something that I think needs to be talked about as well, is having some level of accountability. I think the big issue
Okay.
is relatability too, and how can you relate to that person? And I think parents have a hard time with it now because vaping didn't exist when we were growing up or when my parents were growing up. And so the people just are like, you know what? I don't get what you're saying. I don't relate to you, and it's not going to be me. I'm going to be fine. And they go on with their
Yeah.
day, and then they end up having to hit some point where they actually need to make that change.
Yeah, exactly right. So I just want to clarify that I'm not suggesting that we should actively avoid conversation around the consequences, right? But by focusing on the consequences, what the derivative of that is essentially blaming the person
Mm.
for the problem. You're blaming the person with the problem for the presence of the problem. And that's really all about character. It's all about who you are as a person. And if I come out of the box questioning your character or implying that I already believe that you have some sort of character defect, we can't relate to each other. But if I come out of the starting gate saying, look, I know that your character is fine. You're a complex human being like every other complex human being on the planet. Your responsibility is to make sure that you're engaged getting all the information that you can get. Your responsibility is to make sure you have all the help that you need. Your responsibility is to make sure that you're preparing now for whatever the future is going to hold for you. So in your case, it was the sort of probation issue that was out there. You took responsibility, accountability for your own actions, but you were also an active participant in trying to uh, uncover solutions that got you progressively closer and closer to your overall goal. There was no magic moment where you were anointed by the heavens to suddenly behave very differently and be a different person. And that's what we need to stop expecting that from the folks in our lives who use tobacco products.
And the major selling point for people in recovery is your life will be dramatically better. And I think
Mhm.
it's hard to convince people of that given how challenging and intense that first 2 weeks, week, 30 days, 60 days is when you're quitting a
Yeah.
substance that you've been relying on for a period of time. What can someone's life look like when they give up nicotine and vaping? Like, how will their life dramatically change? Like, sell somebody on the idea that they can actually have fun, have better mental health, have better
Yeah.
relationships, make, a difference in their own lives and others. Like, how do you sell that idea when they quit vaping?
Yeah. So, a great question. I would actually start by bringing the impact of change even a little bit closer temporally, and I would try and bring that conversation that we talked about to a place where we're discussing the kind of yin and yang, the opposing forces, the dual-mindedness of addiction, the logical mind wanting to change the behavior, the irrational or instinctive mind forcing a behavior that you don't want to do. Use the example of hand washing and OCD, right? Person who's washing his or her hands compulsively recognizes, okay, I'm just washing my hands, but you know what? There's a lot. I keep thinking about it all day long. I'm thinking about washing my hands. I can't go to a meeting at work without worrying that I'm not going to be able to get to the sink to wash my hands. There's a lot of weight that is carried because of this dual mindedness going on. That weight is a resistance, is a counterforce to a healthy, happy, easy, productive life. I would suggest that folks who are addicted to their vape devices are suffering essentially that same kind of duality of mind, that same kind of ambivalence. Are, there's a lot of internal conversation, the rational mind wanting to change the behavior, the instinctive mind desperate to continue the behavior, back and forth, inside, outside, recognition after recognition that uh, I vape because I want to, but I can't not want to vape. The biggest, most important, immediate impact of working on changing the behavior is taking all that nonsense off the table. It's all behind you. You're no longer all this resistance, all this weight, all this energy being directed at trying to resolve this duality gone.
Yeah. One of the big pushbacks I've gotten when I've talked to people about quitting weed, for instance,
Mhm.
is what if the person's just happy living their life?
Yeah.
And I think there's truth to that. You don't want to like be come at people from this holier than thou
Yeah.
approach. I also think that when you do that, you risk like the reality is like you're not going to be happy all the time in your life. Number one. Number two is are you letting someone limit themselves and settle based on this idea that a substance is gonna what is gonna contribute to their happiness, right? And I think
Yeah.
that people have to be really honest with themselves and have these conversations and say, "Am I truly, like, happy with my behavior? Am I truly happy with these habits?"
All right.
The answer is yes. Then by all means, if you don't think you're harming your health or you're doing things legally, like, do whatever you want. But the
Yeah.
problem is many times that's not the case. Many times there's something going on, and if people were to truly look at themselves in the mirror and be honest, there was something that they need to actually change, and I think that's where we need to go. And also, I will say the issue I have with that argument, with the happiness argument, is that then it becomes this thing where people then get on the internet and they talk about how amazing certain things are and how healthy it is, and then that's where it becomes a problem because now you have kids that are watching content,
Yeah.
people that
Right.
are like, oh, like so and so is doing it. They're saying it's okay and harmless. I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
And it's just a very, very, very slippery slope that I just think it's about having these honest conversations, trying to lead with compassion because you tell somebody to quit vaping, there's gonna be a lot of negativity in
Yeah.
that because of the emotional attachment there is.
Yeah.
And I just think we have to change the narrative and get to a better approach because I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we're gonna see a lot of issues that are gonna come from people vaping.
Yeah, I agree. We're seeing those issues in our clinic already. Young people in their late 20s, early 30s are presenting where our clinic had almost 100% of our patients had been in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. We're now starting to see a much higher proportion of young people who are coming in with concerns. So I do agree with your contention that people have agency, right? I can't tell you, Doug, how to live your life. What I can do is offer to share some insights that I might have with you to meet your needs. If there, whatever needs that you perceive, I can be there to be supportive, to be helpful, to provide some coaching. You can't force me to work out and lift weights and run and be healthier. But if I have even the remotest curiosity, interest, fantasy about becoming healthier, I could ask you a bunch of questions and you could present yourself as a resource for me. The thing about addiction in general and tobacco product use in particular is that it does make a person feel safe and sound. So I think you got to acknowledge that that is generally a positive experience. The idea of giving up safety and security is nerve wracking. And that is generally a negative experience. So who would want to give up safety and security if they don't have to?
And there's people now that, they've come out and I saw somebody in a conversation, they were asking like a dating expert, like about a red flag.
Yeah.
And they said if somebody who vapes, like it's just like a non-negotiable, like they had like more respect for somebody than if they smoked a cigarette. And you're seeing a lot of that now where you're having people come out
Huh.
and say, like, just why not just smoke cigarettes? You're essentially doing the same thing. What is your position on that?
Wow, that's really fascinating. I hadn't heard that before. I don't see which device you choose to use as a functional characteristic. Like, I don't see there being more or less social value in the type of delivery device that you choose. Like, and maybe that's just because I'm a physician and I have this point of view on that's derived from pharmacology, right? So if I'm gonna give you, I don't know, an antibiotic, to me, it doesn't make a difference. There's no social value to whether I give it to you in the pill form or through the IV form or whatever, right? It did the the thing is that the device has to meet whatever needs. And so I'm not so sure I would call it a red flag or a reason to stop dating that person. Uh, I would say that in either respect, the person that I'm talking to that is using these products is at minimum in need of an honest, truthful, empathic, and supportive conversation.
I agree 100%. I don't think we should judge anyone for what they choose to do
Yeah,
in their personal lives as long as they're, obviously if they're not directly harming themselves and others, but
yeah,
you get my point. I think the reason that vaping specifically has become a turnoff for people
mm,
is because of the frequency that it gets used and
uh,
that people are using it essentially all day. It's not like somebody, at least from what I've seen, people aren't like just getting up in the morning and hitting the vape and
Yeah.
then doing it before they go to bed, which was kind of like the non-negotiables when you smoked a cigarette. You had to have one in the morning and the
Yeah.
evening. People are just doing it all day, and then the scent of it, can just stick on clothes. And obviously, cigarettes can as well. So I'm not comparing the two, but I would imagine it's if people are looking at it from a relationship perspective, it's because of the frequency of use and
Yeah.
the attachment to it that people just can't
Yeah.
leave the house without their vape pen.
Yeah. I can sort of see that actually now that you mention it. That wouldn't, been a long time since I thought about uh, relationships and that kind of thing. But I can certainly see how that would be a real impediment to developing a close relationship with another person.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality, and I'm just the last thing I'll say about it with that is that I think it should raise a concern for anyone when they're dating if
Yeah.
somebody has an addiction to anything, right? And I think
Yeah.
that when
Yeah.
you see someone vaping, it's a very public thing. People will say it's private now because you can kind of do it and you can hide and do it in bathrooms and stuff. But if you're like in a relationship with someone, like you're publicly like hitting this pen like all day
Yeah.
and they're seeing that, and if somebody isn't an addict and they see that, I can definitely understand and see like why that might be, a deal breaker for people. But I think, getting back to the theme of the conversation, I just think this is an issue that needs to be talked about more. I think we need to stop saying, well, this person isn't doing that, so let's just let them do that. And I also think we need to stop shaming people and attacking them as for their character if they're choosing to vape.
Yeah.
Um, and it's tough because we are in a very it's just hard to have nuanced conversations these days. Everybody kind of wants to plant their flag in the sand on one side with these issues, and I think we need to come more to the center.
Yeah. I agree with you there, Doug. I think that that's valuable advice, particularly in the circumstance that you mentioned earlier, where someone says, "Look, I like it. It's me who's I don't do it around my family. I don't do it around the kids. I don't do it at work. But when I'm at home and I'm watching TV, I enjoy doing it. I'm just going to do it." In the old days, we used to think about that as a conversation ender. Like if they like it and they've decided to do it, that was the end of that. The problem with seeing that as a conversation ender is the almost universal response to that has to then be, but, don't you? Right. And so like counter arguing is a natural response. We teach our students to avoid counter arguing at all costs. And when somebody talks about how much they like, to really explore that a little bit more and give them the space they need to discuss what it is they like about it, how they came to this position, the sort of patterns in which they use the product. And then basically ask, is there anything on the other side? Like, have you ever dealt with any other aspect of it that maybe you didn't like as much? Is there anything counterbalancing that in your heart and your mind, that we should talk about? And that opens up the opportunity then to say, well, look, these are the effects that you enjoy. This is the effect that you don't enjoy. How do we maintain this and minimize this? Like, how do we maintain the good aspects of it and how do we minimize the bad aspects of it? Because I think you deserve it both ways. I think you deserve the best on both accounts. That to me is a much more productive and honest way of dealing with these conversation stoppers, than just sort of putting up your hands and saying, "Okay, well, I'll wait for you to come to your senses." That doesn't help anybody.
Absolutely. Well, Frank, this has been an awesome conversation. I've learned a lot. I've gotten a lot of interesting information that some of it was surprising, some not so surprising. And I think the audience is going to get a tremendous amount of value out of this conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. and for sharing all of your thoughts and wisdom with us.
Doug, thanks so much for the opportunity. And if you don't mind, I might like to just say to your audience members that we published a book last year. It's called Why People Smoke. It's available on Amazon. It's perfectly accessible to family members, people who are worried about their young adolescents picking up the vape pen, sort of understanding why the behavior happens and what a more productive approach to coaching them toward behavior change goals might look like.
Highly recommend checking it out. Frank, your work is really important and meaningful. So thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you, Doug. Take good care.